Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Scott Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, otherwise known as HEAL Utah. I'd like to welcome the members of the press and also the supporters to gather here today to talk about our request to Governor Herbert to veto House Bill 220, and we're here to talk about that and to explain why. The organizations that are here supporting this effort include HEAL Utah, the Utah chapter of the Sierra Club, the Utah Nurses Association, the Alliance for Better Utah, and the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. We've also had nearly 1,000 Utah residents from HEAL Utah and many others from other organizations send messages to their legislators in the last 2 weeks asking them to vote against this bill. So what is behind this bill? Why did it get introduced? Well, Energy Solutions wants to continue to profit from bringing large volumes of hazardous waste from across the nation into Utah. They're particularly interested in securing contracts to dispose of two major types of radioactive waste at their site in Clive near the Great Salt Lake. One of Energy Solutions' polluting business opportunities is to bring over 800,000 metric tons of depleted uranium currently stockpiled by the Department of Energy in sites in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. Depleted uranium is what is left over after making nuclear fuel rods and nuclear weapons. It's a unique type of waste that starts out with relatively low-level radioactivity, but then becomes more and more radioactive for thousands of years into the future. Energy Solutions would also like to win the contracts to demolish dozens of nuclear power plants around the country that are scheduled for decommissioning and dump all of that Class A, B, and C waste here in Utah, a state that's never used a single kilowatt of electricity those nuclear power plants generated. Our current nuclear waste policy is clear. Only Class A radioactive waste, which remains toxic for about 100 years, can currently be disposed of by Energy Solutions here in the state. The more hazardous Classes B and C waste, which remain hot for several centuries, are banned. There are already 3 other disposal sites in the country that can accept Class B and C waste. And under the current policy in Utah, to gain a permit for depleted uranium disposal, Energy Solutions has to prove through a detailed technical and scientific assessment that their site can safely store that waste for 10,000 years or more. Those assessments are expected to be completed this spring. So we're going to have 4 people with different levels of expertise in different areas talk about the issues specifically related to the bill. The first is Ashley Soltizak, the Executive Director of the Utah chapter of Sierra Club, who's going to talk about the history of our current nuclear waste policy, how we arrived at it, where it came from. Jessica Reimer, a policy associate at HEAL Utah, is going to talk about how House Bill 220 introduces ambiguity into our current policy. Steve Nelson, a BYU geology professor, will talk about why the current policy requiring a 10,000-year DU performance assessment is important and what the details of that assessment include. And Matt McCarty, a chemist and a longtime resident of Tooele County, will talk about his experience in Tooele and his concerns with disposing of this waste out near his home. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Ashley, and then I will wrap up at the end and make a few concluding comments.
All right, thank you, Scott. As he said, I'm Ashley Soltizak. I'm the director of the Utah chapter of the Sierra Club. And I want to thank everyone for coming out today to urge Governor Herbert to reject HB220 Radioactive Waste Amendments. In the last 5 years that I've been an environmental lobbyist in this state, this is easily the most egregious piece of legislation that I've ever seen come across my desk. It fundamentally shifts nuclear waste policy in this state, and allowing for blended waste and for removing key conditions for the approval of Energy Solutions' bid to bring over 800,000 tons of depleted uranium to Utah is the wrong move for this state. Often up here, it feels like Groundhog Day, with versions of the same issue being brought and fought in new ways year after year. And this issue is perhaps the best example of that endless game of whack-a-mole that we all have to play. So I'll give you a little bit of context to this monumental decision which now looms over our state. Back in 2005, the Utah State Legislature took proactive action with bipartisan support and voted to ban Class B and C level waste streams. Those types of nuclear waste pose a threat for about 300 to 500 years. which is why it seems incomprehensible that we are now fighting to stop the same legislature from fast-tracking a waste that will literally persist for millennia. But that seems to be how things go up here. Now, back in 2009, some big fights began with Energy Solutions over their bids to bring in hotter foreign waste from Italy and to bring depleted uranium. And in response, a diverse coalition of business leaders, religious leaders, elected officials, and community advocates formed and called themselves the Alliance for Unity. They expressed strong and unanimous opposition to storage in Utah of waste material containing higher levels of radioactivity than current laws permit. The leaders included the president of the LDS Church, Russell Ballard, former Salt Lake City Mayor Ralph Becker, renowned community activist Archie Archuleta, both of the publishers of the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News, as well as Michael Young, the president of the University of Utah, and many more notable public figures. Their powerful arguments still hold water today. But before it became widely known, Energy Solutions went so far as to begin accepting shipments of depleted uranium from the Department of Energy without obtaining the appropriate permissions to dispose of this extremely long-lived nuclear waste. When the public found out, there was enormous outcry, which led Governor Herbert to stop the next trains of depleted uranium, which were already bound for Utah. Then he ordered a study to determine if the site was appropriate for disposal. Not surprisingly, Energy Solutions then hired a consultant who in short order confirmed that their extremely shallow site in a historic lake bed was appropriate for the disposal of hundreds of thousands of tons of depleted uranium, despite recommendations from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which state that shallow disposal of less than 3 meters is likely not appropriate for significant quantities of depleted uranium. So in response, the state then hired their own consultant, who in a series of interrogatories challenged a number of the assumptions in Energy Solutions' plan. They looked at a range of factors, from groundwater contamination for both aquifers to root uptake for plants, and to potential exposure pathways for inadvertent intruders, and much, much more. The state actually even issued a highly skeptical safety evaluation report in 2015, but then pulled back and closed the public comment period early at the company's request. In that report, they outlined conditions for approval, and one of those was that the waste shall remain Class A waste. Now, a second iteration of that analysis will be released this summer, which is exactly why the timing of this legislation is deeply troubling. We will soon have an answer from the state on this decades-long issue, and so we'd ask why Energy Solutions would want to change one of the core conditions of this report, the requirement that the waste will remain Class A waste, unless to game the system in their favor. They know that depleted uranium will not remain Class A waste and will eventually exceed Class C standards. They know that bringing it here will violate our current state laws. So instead, they're seeking to change those state laws at the 11th hour, and that's fundamentally wrong. Any decision on depleted uranium should be made after the outcome of the state's safety assessment. So now we need Governor Herbert to step up again and protect our future and the legacy we leave. To quote that diverse coalition from over a decade ago, we see no reason why Utah should become one of the world's nuclear garbage dumps. We must do all in our power to protect Utah's image as a beautiful, safe, and healthy place. And as we do so, we protect not only our economic future, but also the well-being of our children and the future generations yet unborn. Thank you. So now you're going to hear from HEAL's Policy Associate Jessica Reimer.
All right, thank you, Ashley, and thank you all for coming out today. Like she mentioned, my name is Jessica Reimer, and I'm a policy associate with HEAL Utah. So first of all, we'd like to thank the Governor's Office and the Department of Environmental Quality for their work in vastly improving the language of HB220 Radioactive Waste Amendments as it made its way through the legislative process. However, there are still a number of things that we have issue with in the bill. So what does this bill actually do? Ultimately, it affects how radioactive waste is classified and assessed by the Division of Waste Management and Radiation Control. Prior to the passage of this bill, only Class A waste has been allowed into the state. Class A waste typically becomes inert in around 100 to 300 years. With this new law, the director of the division can allow Class B and C waste into the state through a process called blending, which mixes different waste streams to meet Class A standards. Since 2005, all Class B and C waste has been banned from the state due to concerns with exposure and public health risk. More importantly, the legislation requires that all waste be solely classified at the time of acceptance, which directly refers to a waste stream called depleted uranium, like you've already heard about today. Energy Solutions has been trying to bring depleted uranium to the state for over a decade. While depleted uranium currently falls within the standards of Class A waste, it becomes much, much hotter and more radioactive over time, and eventually exceeds the standards for Class C waste, which can be over 70 times more radioactive than Class A. Depleted uranium does not become inert in 100 years. It does not become inert in 500 years. Depleted uranium grows in radioactivity for millennia, contaminating its storage site eternally. Allowing depleted uranium to be stored at Energy Solutions' Clyde facility means that the state is creating a radioactive site forever. This is and will continue to be an ongoing concern for us. Another concerning piece of the legislation is the shift from classifying waste using radioactive concentration limits to using dose limits. Concentration limits are an objective way to measure radioactivity. Dose limits, or the amount of exposure to radioactivity an individual receives, allow the classification of waste to be more subjective, as it can change based on the type of containers that hold the waste and how exposure occurs. The regulations currently in place at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are written based on concentration limits, which means that our state laws may now not conform with the necessary federal laws. This could potentially place Utah's status as an agreement state with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in jeopardy and affect the ability of the division to control the regulatory process locally. Despite these concerns, we recognize there are some safeguards that have been written into the legislation. These include the need for a completed and accepted performance assessment, or technical assessment that analyzes the suitability of the Clyde site for storage of depleted uranium. The state and Energy Solutions have been engaged in this assessment process for the past 7 years, and we believe that it is critical for the results to not only be completed but also released to the public. It also requires the designation by the director of a federal storage cell at the Clyde facility where depleted uranium would be buried. And finally, an agreement that the Federal Department of Energy will accept perpetual management of the waste, as well as financial stewardship once Energy Solutions dissolves as a company. We agree that all of these should be part of the state policy, but these do not overcome the problems that the bill introduces. HEAL Utah has been working for the past 10 years to ensure that the 800,000 tons of depleted uranium across the country waiting for permanent storage does not end up contaminating the environment in Utah, nor posing a threat to the public health of our citizens forever. It is a waste that belongs in deep geologic storage, not storage less than 10 feet deep that the Clyde facility offers. This bill, though better than it started, is yet another small chip away at a once robust state nuclear waste policy. We urge the governor to veto this bill and maintain the policy that safeguards public health and the environment. Thank you very much. I'll now introduce Dr. Steve Nelson, who will discuss the technical concerns with depleted uranium.
Hi, I'm Steve Nelson. I am a professor of geology and geochemistry at Brigham Young University. I have to make a disclaimer at this point. It is university policy that whenever faculty speak out on an issue like this, that they make it clear that we're not speaking for the institution or its sponsor, the LDS Church. So nobody call President Worthen or the church office building and complain. I've complied with university policy. Just a little bit on my qualifications. I'm not here to brag, but I, shortly after graduate school, worked in the high-level waste industry on the Yucca Mountain Project for 4 years in the 90s. I then accepted my current position at Brigham Young University, and during that time, between the years of 1998 and 2008, I was a member, vice chair, and chair of the Utah Radiation Control Board. And another feature of my background is I've conducted extensive research into the geologic history of the Lake Bonneville system, which is very relevant to the issue of depleted uranium. Now, you've already heard some things about depleted uranium, or DU. Excuse me, DU as it's often called. You've heard mention of the enormous volumes, up to 800,000 metric tons. Add a mere another 200,000 tons, and you're talking about 1 million tons of material. You've heard some information about the longevity of depleted uranium. It doesn't go away after a century or 3 centuries or 5 centuries. The half-life of depleted uranium is 4.5 billion years. That's the age of the Earth. And so when you put 800,000 tons of depleted uranium in the West Desert, you're going to concentrate it there, and it's going to stay there forever. Well, actually, it's not going to stay there forever. It's going to stay there until the lake level of the Great Salt Lake, Lake Bonneville system rises again and obliterates those piles. You've heard that it becomes more radioactive with time. It does. It increases by a factor of about 12 or 13. One thing that has not been mentioned concerning depleted uranium or uranium in general is that in alkaline waters, the kinds that will exist in a renewal of the Lake Bonneville system, doesn't have to rise all that far to get to Clive, or in the groundwater system, is that uranium is quite soluble in alkaline waters. Depending upon what you use as a starting point for your calculation, maybe a 1 or 2 grams per liter, potentially. Another thing that has not been mentioned, in addition to the radiological hazard, uranium is also a chemical hazard. It's a toxic heavy metal. The Environmental Protection Agency considers it and particularly hazardous to the human kidneys, kidney toxin. So I don't understand why anyone with foreknowledge would place this an enormous volume of this material in a place where maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in my children's or grandchildren's lifetime, but eventually is going to get out and be dispersed into the environment. As has been mentioned, depleted uranium requires deep burial. For instance, the waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico, disposes of highly radioactive material in thick, deep salt deposits. That would be an appropriate place for depleted uranium, for example. Some mention has been made of performance assessments. I'm certainly in favor of them. The more rigorous, the better. But the whole premise of doing a performance assessment, a calculation on what will happen to this waste in a surface landfill in the West Desert, is fundamentally flawed. You can do computer calculations till the cows come home. It's eventually going to get out. And why would anyone do that with the foreknowledge that this is going to happen is a little bit beyond me. So I wonder if the legislators that passed this bill really understood depleted uranium, how could they in good conscience vote in favor of it? I wonder how management at Energy Solutions, who certainly understand the nature of depleted uranium, can in good conscience seek to dispose of it. And I hope the governor remembers the conversation that he and I and some former HEAL executive director and staff members had in his office several years ago, where we talked about this. And I presented some of the same information to him. I hope he remembers it. I hope he remembers our conversation and vetoes this bill.
Good afternoon, everyone. As a lot of the material that's really pertinent to this bill has already been covered, I'll keep my comments relatively brief. My name's Matt McCarty. I am a chemist. I live in Tooele County. I've lived there for over 10 years, and all of our children graduated from high school there. And I continue to live there. My wife and I will also continue to live there for the foreseeable future. I'm here to talk to you today, but more specifically, I'm here to say directly to Governor Herbert, veto HB220. It's bad policy. Here's why it's bad policy, my friends. It's bad policy for the reasons cited before. It really contradicts good hazard assessment and risk management principles. By declaring depleted uranium Class A waste and leaving it with that classification at the time of acceptance, this ignores the future hazard that will exist. According to typical and classical risk assessment and risk management principles, we will look at the worst case scenario and then take actions to prevent the worst case scenario from occurring. So you can see how this legislation is backwards. That's my primary concern, in addition to all the concerns that have already been mentioned. That's why this bill should be vetoed. Secondly, it reverses the current political situation when it comes to approving the reception of hazardous and especially radioactive waste. Currently, that decision-making authority lies with the Board of Hazardous and Radioactive Waste. This bill, if passed, and it's been passed, if it's put into action in the public forum, this will now place the sole responsibility of that decision with the Director of Hazardous Waste and Hazardous and Radioactive Waste. So instead of a diverse panel with multiple perspectives looking at a wide variety of concerns, we're going to ask one person who can be lobbied very strenuously to make that decision, leave that decision with one person. It doesn't take away the importance at all of the Board of Hazardous and Radioactive Waste, but it severely diminishes that body's deliberative process. One last thing, friends. I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about depleted uranium, and not from a radioactivity perspective, but rather to understand that depleted uranium, when it arrives, it doesn't remain only depleted uranium very long at all. The radioactivity is the energy that comes off as the uranium decays to other elements. It becomes other things. Here's a list of what some of those other elements are. Radon. Utah, the state of Utah has a very public program to control the public's exposure to radon gas. Radium. Radium used to be used to paint glow-in-the-dark watch dials until the workers who were painting the dials started dying of cancer. Thallium. Thallium, up until 1973, was used as a pesticide and rat poison, and it was banned by presidential executive order because of its toxicity in the environment. Polonium, another one of those decay elements. Polonium was used to kill a man named Litvinenko in London in 2006. He ingested it and he died in 3 weeks of severe radiation poisoning. That's what depleted uranium will become, and it won't become that in 100 years or 10,000 years or 40,000 years. It's constantly becoming all of these elements, and they will all be present. That's why this is bad policy. When, as Dr. Nelson said, those elements get out into the environment, they will be in the water, they'll be in the air, and they'll be in the dust, where the dust can be carried by predominantly westerly winds into the populated areas of the Wasatch Front, Tooele County. That, my friends, is why this bill must be stopped. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Matt. So to wrap up, I just want to give you 4 things that have been said by elected officials as this bill has been moving through, and respond to each of them. The first one is several legislators have said, I have toured Energy Solutions' site and I'm convinced that they can handle depleted uranium safely. Well, there's no way that that conclusion can be reached from a company-sponsored tour of that facility. That's why detailed technical assessments are being done by scientists of the site. Now, we don't question the commitment to safety among the Energy Solutions frontline workers in their day-to-day work. But we strongly doubt that shallow burial at Energy Solutions site is appropriate for DU, and we oppose the corporate business model of profiting from using Utah's West Desert as the nation's nuclear waste dumping ground. Second quote, well, depleted uranium is not radiologically hazard in its current form. You've heard from Matt and Dr. Nelson about how DU becomes more radioactive over time, but you also heard that it's currently chemically toxic. There's no environmental emergency or urgency to move the 800,000 metric tons of DU from its current stockpiles in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. The Department of Energy simply wants to quit paying to store it there, and Energy Solutions wants to make money by bringing it here. Third quote, those who oppose this bill offer no alternatives to disposing of this waste. Well, we believe the appropriate place for radioactive waste that is or becomes more hazardous than Class A is in the deep geologic caverns, such as the one in New Mexico that Dr. Nelson referred to. Last quote, Utah needs to do our part to solve the nation's nuclear waste disposal problem. Well, Utah has never used nuclear power, but we have suffered many times over at the hands of the nuclear industry. Nuclear bomb testing has exposed people in southwestern Utah to radiation. The uranium mines in southeastern Utah have exposed mine workers and continue to expose those residents from the mine tailings. The White Mesa uranium mill near Blanding has leached radioactivity into the water and exposed those residents. The uranium tailings on the Colorado River have leached radioactivity into the river. And the radioactive waste that's already been brought in by Energy Solutions has exposed each Utah to an increased risk of cancer and other diseases for over a century now. We've more than done our part to help solve the nation's nuclear problem. In 2015, Governor Herbert said at his monthly press conference, I have a hunch that depleted uranium is hotter than Class A waste and should be reclassified as something else. The governor's hunch is correct. We strongly urge him to stick to his guns and veto House Bill 220. Thank you very much. The speakers and the representatives of supporting organizations will be available for press interviews, and the supporters in attendance are now going to head over to the governor's office to drop off 1,000 of these postcards that are on the podium to the governor to show him how many residents have asked him not to allow depleted uranium to come into the state. The press is invited to stay here for interviews or to join the group that goes over to the governor's office, and we thank you for coming.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. We have 750 postcards, and we have 1,000 emails sent in to representatives, senators, and the governor. All signatures on the backside asking the governor to keep DU out of Utah. So thank you, everyone. Yay!
I can just hold it up.
Okay, I've got a bigger version of it too.
Great.
I'll hold that.
That's
You want
perfect.
the bigger version or you want just...
No, the ones that of the pile.
We're in the lab to test the structure.
Thank you. I'm going to buy this one on the green side, the whole thing.
Where's town yard? My name is Al.
All right, here we go.
Oh.